Well, good morning, everybody. This is Developers, Why API Management Should Be Important to You. I'm Scott Morrison, the CTO of Layer 7, and I'm actually talking to you from Vancouver, Canada, where it's a chilly morning here on the West Coast. But wherever you are, I think you're going to be in for a treat, because this is going to be a really, really interesting webinar. I've been excited about this one for a while. Let me tell you why. It's an exciting time. This is, I think, in a lot of ways, a golden age for development. Golden age for software developers, but also a golden age for technology. What we're seeing is this kind of collision of new blood enthusiasm, but a lot of real cool technology. It's a time of building. It's a time where all of a sudden the technological tools are there and the impetus and the interest to make some pretty interesting things happen. I was at a conference recently, QCon actually, a developer conference in London back in March. And the thing that really struck me about this conference was the energy and the enthusiasm there. I haven't seen that since, really the golden age of Java and the Java 1 conferences circa 1998-99. So obviously I'm dating myself pretty significantly here. But the thing is, the important thing about coming out of this whole thing is that this is a time that reminds me of the enthusiasm that we saw 10 or 12 years ago, where a lot of good things happen. But now I think it's tempered with some real knowledge about what really works and what really doesn't. So one of the great drivers of this, of course, is the whole API revolution and the whole sort of rise of the new developer. And nobody is more at the center of this thing than my guest today, which is James Governor, an industry analyst and co-founder of RedMonk. These guys are truly at the center of this revolution. They're talking to the people who are actually doing stuff. They're talking to the people who are actually building things. And so I'm really excited, actually, to have James on the line with me from London, actually. And he'll be opening up this webinar and talking about exactly his perspective on the new API economy, on governance, and where things are going. Then what's going to happen is I'm going to fill in and actually give you a demonstration of some new tools, what we call at Layer 7 our API portal, which is basically technology that's there to enable developers to build cool apps. It's there really to tell them all about what APIs are available and to manage the access for developers into those APIs. So a couple little housekeeping things. Questions, definitely put them into the chat box. We'll try to collate everything and answer a few questions near the end. And of course, social media is at the center of all of this that we're doing today. The hashtag for this is L7webinar, and definitely follow a lot of us on Twitter. So with that, what I want to do is turn it over to James, who should have the conch now, if the internet works as it should. And you'll hear from me again, probably in about 20 minutes or so. So take it away, James.
Yes, well, good morning or good afternoon if you're in Europe, or if you're in Australia, perhaps it's a different good morning. Anyway, hello, everybody. Thanks for taking the time. I've got to agree that this is a very exciting time for software development, software developers in general. I don't want to talk too much about my company, but the one thing I would say is that we were founded in 2002. And at the time, some of the things we said about empowering developers and why developers were so important was considered a little bit out there. We were talking a lot about open source and its importance, and the fact that that was a developer-led phenomenon. But there was a sense that development was something you could outsource and just get the same business benefits with code that was built anywhere on the planet. You could just set some requirements down and everything would be golden. The simple fact is that didn't really work out. Outsourcing has been a checkered bag, certainly in terms of software delivery. And I think that new models have begun to emerge. And so whilst RedMonk may have been outliers in 2002 because we spent all of our time talking to software developers rather than enterprise purchasers, in the intervening time, we've seen a pretty significant change. Cloud has been a huge part of that, and clearly Apple, probably more than any other company, has really done an amazing job of making it clear to business how important it is that they work more closely with developers and what the opportunities are. And I think web APIs is a big, big part of that. So I think the first thing that we need to understand is we've seen this very significant growth in public APIs. So programmable web is an interesting and useful service. I'd advise you to check it out. It basically tracks publicly available APIs that developers might want to use. And we've seen this great growth curve. And frankly, when they hit that 5,000 public APIs mark, that's very interesting. On the one hand, that shows very clearly that more and more organizations are saying, okay, great, we need to make APIs available, and hopefully people will target them. But of course, that creates some challenges too, because if there's 5,000 of the things, how do you know which ones you're actually going to use? And it goes further than that. If we go into the next slide, you can see very clearly that some companies in particular, their APIs are amazingly popular. When you look at Twitter and, it's over 13 billion API calls per day, that is very significant. And obviously from Twitter's perspective, that is a massive scaling challenge. And I think that's one of the issues that the enterprise now needs to think about. They're obviously not going to have, in most cases, the scale of Twitter. But let's take, for example, filing taxes. There's certainly, a few days a year when the Inland Revenue Service is going to need, is going to have a huge, huge spike. And if they made stuff available via API, as in fact increasingly they are doing, I mean, certainly if you're using Intuit to file your tax returns and so on, that does generate significant load. So, whilst everybody isn't going to have the scale challenges of Twitter, many businesses are going to have times of the year when they're likely to have a lot of hits to an API that they make available. But I think the other thing this shows is really just those calls is really a reflection of the fact that people are understanding that this is the way to get stuff done. I think we're running through a very interesting time at the moment because we're seeing a lot of fragmentation. I think this is partly led by developers. Developers have basically said, look, we're not going to use the tools that you think are best for us. We're going to use the tools that we know are best for us. We've got the NoSQL movement, and let's not get confused and worried too much that people are that it's no SQL. I mean, the simple fact is that some of the early NoSQL technologies are now, looking increasingly transactional, supporting ACID and whatnot. But definitely, having lived through, like Scott, I've got to admit, I remember sort of the time from 1995 to 1999 and so on, so I'm aging myself as well. I'm sure all of you, or many of you, have lived through, I guess we could call it the age of the Oracle database. Oracle had a lock on everything, certainly the expectation, oh yeah, stick it in Oracle, that's just our corporate standard. Architects would say, yeah, just use Oracle. And it really had a lock on architecture thinking, and therefore the choices developers could make. Obviously, that's changed a lot now, and the web has been a big part of that. The fact that developers now have access to open source technology, some of it that was built in the cloud by the likes of Twitter and so on, is now being sent over the transom and made available. And we're seeing that data choices is certainly fragmenting dramatically. Another area of extreme fragmentation is programming languages. Again, if you go back to 1999, it was like, oh yeah, good, okay, all we're going to have is Java and .NET, and that's about it. That's what we need to learn. I remember the general manager of IBM Software, Steve Mills at the time, saying Java is enough. We don't need any more programming languages. Certainly, if you look at the landscape today, things are significantly different. Java is mutating. We're seeing interesting languages running on the JVM. We're seeing things like Scala. If we look at the rise of JavaScript, I think that's extremely interesting as a phenomenon. It used to be that learning JavaScript meant you weren't a serious software developer. Today, I would say the opposite is probably true. So the choice of data store is fragmenting. The choice of programming language is fragmenting. Arguably, the deployment environment is in some sense becoming simpler, because for a lot of developers, they would say that is just Amazon. But frankly, that there's a great deal of complexity. And what does that mean? If there are more APIs, more languages, and everything else, actually the API becomes a means to stabilize. Because, of course, you can have multiple languages with libraries to support an API. So when an API is made available, you can let other people do the work. We've seen this again and again with popular APIs, with useful APIs, that actually it's the language folks and the framework developers that begin to fill out what was needed to support that API. So I think in a sense, whilst APIs are proliferating, it certainly, in some senses, becomes less of a moving target, although obviously we have seen many vendors break APIs over time, and that's another issue which is going to need to be managed. So we've had this proliferation and an explosion of forms, and we don't necessarily know which ones are going to succeed, and that means we do need to be more agile, but certainly from the enterprise perspective, generally find it's not acceptable to just have an API that's going to suddenly break. You know, it may be okay for certain workloads, but enterprises have expectations and considerations. So then you have to think, well, you know, how do we drive redundancy, or how do we really ensure that if something does break, we can reverse it? So I mean, you know, if you listen to Salesforce, they will claim, oh, it's just a URL, you can hit it, it's no problem. But I think you and I both know that it's a little bit more complicated than that. So this explosion of forms is creating opportunity, but also challenges. I talked about fragmentation. This is just a graph. At RedMonk, we do track from a data perspective popularity of languages, and I just think it's very interesting. You know, if you look up and to the right, to see things like Objective-C on there. Obviously, Apple is a significant part of developers' lives, frankly. And so if you're building APIs, it's a way to address that. Whereas in the past, you would have been thinking, oh, wait, what environments are the developers using? Well, you know, I think increasingly they are making these choices. We do need to support them. It's not our choice. We can't tell them to program in a particular language. We need to be thinking about supporting the languages that they want to use and going to where they are. A good example of that, and some of this data, in fact, comes from GitHub. If you're a developer, I'm sure you're familiar with GitHub. If you're not, you should be. It is basically the future of development. It is a social platform that enables for forking and resolution of software on the fly. If nothing else, as I say, if you're going to go where they are and you want to have an API that's going to be a success, GitHub is a great place to start building a community around it. We've seen something really, really interesting, and this goes back to my point about developers not needing to ask for permission for things, which is very interesting data. So Chris Tacey works at a company called AppFog, great little cloud player, and he did some great research where he looked at the deals that were basically happening in terms of venture capital, and you know, it was pretty straightforward data. And then he began to look at it, and something very interesting happened when he noticed that, look, what was this disjunction in 2006 that suddenly meant deal size was going to decrease, but the number of deals was going to significantly increase. And what did that mean? Well, I could ask you the question, but this format is perhaps not quite interactive enough. I know that some of you are thinking, oh yeah, come on, James, you already mentioned it. It's Amazon Web Services. And that's absolutely right. Amazon Web Services from an infrastructure perspective is exactly what happened. But from a business perspective, Y Combinator was launched. And Y Combinator is a very interesting incubator model. They take a significant share of early startups, but they definitely drive them on, and they've had a ton of successes. And I think what's interesting is if we've seen this decoupling of model in terms of how much you need to invest in order to have a real success as a startup or to have a sustainable startup, well then what can the enterprise learn from this? And it's this how do we, as I say, how can we change our governance structures that are going to enable the enterprise to become more like these sorts of startups, to take more advantage of the cloud? And clearly the API economy has been a big part of this change as well. Many, if not all of the companies that have been founded in this way have began with a platform strategy and moved to API. And again, what can we learn from them and what is the opportunity? Developers today are increasingly taking a model where they're foraging for things. you go out and find the stuff that you're going to bring together and build a service for. And one of the things that we need to forage for is APIs. Which APIs are the ones that we're going to find most useful? Now, foraging's great. You know, you can go out and find this interesting food, but you need to know what you're doing. Not to put too fine a point on it, you know, in the age of open source, you know, there may have been some fears about what was in the code, but certainly with an API, well, let's just say you wouldn't want to, you know, you wouldn't want to forage a mushroom unless you really, really knew what you were doing. So again, I think if we look at developers and the way they're working today, that's one of the first things they do is just go out and find out what are the assets that are available, and let's build on that. Packaging and synthesizing services. So the first thing that they are doing is going out and finding it, but as I say, that needs governance in its own right. So you're foraging, you're finding the things, and then you need to productize, then you need to work harden, then you need to forge. Again, you can give developers a lot of freedom, but from an operational management perspective, you do need to fix things down. Clearly, you know, Twitter can afford to fall over, and actually a lot of enterprise services can, but not all enterprise services can. Another thing I think it's worth considering, as you look at, well, you know, what kind of availability can we get for our APIs, and perhaps what availability can we deliver, is actually web availability has been proven to be really quite impressive in many, many cases. So I don't know if you've looked at the theory of consistency, availability, and partitionability, the CAP theorem. That's led a lot of thinking in terms of web developers and how they get things done. You should take a look at that while you're planning your API strategy. So on quality, I think one of the things that is really difficult about the API economy is that you can't get you're not necessarily in a position, if you're taking advantage of a range of APIs and some of them external, to ensure that the developers are also the same people doing QA. That's one of the things that certainly, I mean, I've got this example here of shipbuilding. What they found was that if you had different people doing the rivets, from checking the rivets, that led to problems. Because, yeah, you can get a guy he would do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rivets a day, but the remediation could be a problem. And I think one of the issues around API management and understanding, yes, we can take advantage of them, but we are going to have some inspection. We are going to have to know what works. And in some cases, we're going to want to know who the developers are. And again, that is effectively a governance question. So on engagement, I mean, if we're going to make an API available, you know, it's not going to build a community itself. We should have learned this from open source. We saw that you know, I think there was a misperception that, oh yeah, I want some developers to build something for me. I know, I'll just ship some crappy code and they'll make it awesome, and then I'll be able to use it. Well, clearly that didn't really work. I mean, we were always surprised. We did talk to people, and they genuinely seemed to think that, you know, there was this like horde of developers that just could not wait to work on their stuff. The simple fact is that developers are remarkably under pressure in terms of time. You know, we're all busy, and developers are under sort of huge demand at the moment. Nobody is finding it easy to hire developers. Well, if you are, please let me know, and I'll have to take a leaf out of your book and teach some of my other clients how you did it. But I think the important thing is, just like open source, the API economy is a social phenomenon. So you need really good community management. So if you're an enterprise that wants to do this, it's not optional that you take a community-based approach and that you invest in developer relations. You know, that's not something that, it's just not an option. You do not get successful APIs without somebody to serve it. Now, it might not be the normal kind of service you expect. So, you know, people go, oh, wait, I'm using this Google thing and there is nobody that I can call. Yeah, there's certainly some truth to that, but it's very, very likely that one of the core developers is either blogging or available on IRC, or they are on Twitter and you can actually reach out to them and talk to them. Again, it's a much more social approach. It's not as process-oriented. And I think that organizations need to understand this, that social is a big part of this. It's not optional. So, and that's one way that you might be able to get the project funded, frankly, because probably everybody in IT is, wait, we need to be doing, everyone's saying we need to be doing something social. Well, API would be a good place to invest because actually that's going to drive business value. One thing to understand is you probably already got some people that are really good at this. It's like blogging. Blogging can be tremendously valuable because, if you let people know what you're doing and you're more observable, then hiring gets easier. Hiding your light under a bushel may be great, but it certainly doesn't help you find great developers. Developers want to know what is happening. And I think the key thing is just to find out who in your team is community-oriented. Chances are high that you got some introverts and they may not be the right people for the role, but the chances are also high that you actually have some people with good community management skills. That said, don't just dump on them, oh, here is a new job on top of your existing jobs. This is an important job and should be treated as such. So web APIs set the bar for consumability. I mean, we've been through the SOA wars. We've got, the scars. We all remember, the joys of WSDL and SOAP. Well, clearly, web APIs were much more consumable, which is one of the reasons they became more popular and effective. Yeah, final point. APIs really don't build communities. You do need people to do that. I mean, even Google and Facebook, with their amazingly popular APIs, they do have people to help manage that. But of course, as enterprises, if you are going to have an API, you are going to need to provide the kind of level of service that your customers will expect. You can't just have a website that doesn't have a phone number, probably. And on that point, it's important to understand, I mean, in terms of designing your API, and this is super important, yeah, a bad API is far worse than no API, because a bad API is going to generate a lot of support requirements. And if you have that, that's going to instantly impact on your cost model for the business you want to enable in terms of taking an approach that makes it easier for developers to work with you using your APIs. Good APIs generate a great deal of really good PR. I don't know if PR is the right word, but certainly developer experience is really, no developer wants to work with you if you haven't thought about their needs. If you haven't thought about, things like beauty, frankly. Developers do want to see a beautiful API. They want to have something that's very easy to use. And if they find one that is, they're going to tell a lot of other folks. Developers are increasingly social. Well, it makes RedMonk's life easier. I can tell you, we have a ton of people that we talk to on a daily basis so that we can understand this stuff better. So, yep, I mentioned SOAP. Don't want to talk about that too much. It has a role in the enterprise, there is no doubt. You have a bunch of services that are defined in a way that are probably providing value now. You've got integrations, complex integrations between your business applications and your middleware. You don't need to throw all that out. But in terms of web APIs, we really should be learning from that. RESTful interfaces have proven to be far more popular with developers, and the new breed of developers that is coming up from college and so on, they're definitely expecting to see that. They don't want to go through WS Splat. XML still has its role, but when we look at web apps, JSON is increasingly the way that we're describing things and making web services more useful. So these are still web services. I don't think we should get away from the notion of services. They're just a little bit less complex in terms of how they're described. Going with an API-first approach really leads you to think about service modularity, because if you're stringing things together and working with other services, that's just so important. And of course, we talked about reuse in SOA a lot, and I think it was sometimes after the fact, like let the developers build something and then we'll work out how to turn it into something that can be used. As opposed to really forcing modularity at design time. And I think API-first design really helps with that. So we need APIs that are easy to learn, easy to use, and easy to extend. I would advise you to read an essay on API design by a guy called Joshua Block from Google. He's also written in Java. Very smart guy. So we want minimum progress to declare victory. Don't allow everybody to generate more requirements. An API is going to be more effective probably the less it does rather than the more it does. Don't worry about the edge cases. manage for exceptions, fine, but don't drive that into the core API design and make it too complicated. So what are these APIs and what might they be like? You know, one thing as a business that you might want to think about is, you know, what assets do we actually have? Jason Fried from 37 Signals made a really interesting analogy with the lumber industry, and they used to have all the stuff that was waste, and they've turned it into profit. If you were in England and you were a northerner, you might say, where there's muck, there's brass. In that, you know, what you think of as waste products may in fact be really useful, and data's a great example of that. So think about what the APIs, what we might expose, what our partners might find value from. You know, basically anytime you're engaging with any stakeholder, we're generating data, and that data is likely to be useful to us internally, but it also may be useful to external stakeholders. But let me tell you, management is going to be interested in this information. Why not make it available as an API that they can take advantage of, and then look to broaden that out to other constituencies? So, you know, your location, we'll take a social approach and look at influence patterns within the organization, begin to use a machine learning approach in terms of customer service feedback to identify problems and do a more effective job of fixing them. Sentiment analysis is another opportunity. Geographical trending has become far more easy to do than it ever was because of these, well, Google Maps API. I mean, that was the classical API that got us started on all of this stuff. You know, GIS used to be a nightmare. It used to be really hard, really expensive. It's a lot easier than it used to be. So bringing this stuff together and thinking, well, what assets do we have that we could make available as an API? Certainly that is an approach that's beginning to pay dividends. And, you know, I think just in terms of this, what used to be a waste product and now is valuable, you may or may not have seen, well, in fact, it was today, so if you're watching a replay, recently the IPO of a company called Splunk. Splunk is particularly interesting because basically they their business on providing business data based on log files. So log files used to be something we didn't really know what to do with, didn't take advantage of. They've just done a more than $1 billion IPO today based on the fact that they can analyze your log files. So as I say, if you're thinking about data at all today, it's probably a byproduct. And if so, why not think about turning that into something that is useful, and that's an API, and that's a good place to potentially get started. So we'll save questions to once we've had a chance to get back to Scott and hear a little bit more from Layer 7 about yeah, API developers.
All right, listen, thanks, James. That was really, really interesting, actually. One of the things that you mentioned that really, really struck me in particular was that, you know, developers don't like to be told what tools to use. And you know, as a developer myself, although maybe an aging one, I'm exactly the same way. I mean, the worst situation for me has always been, you know, one of those scenarios where somebody comes to me and says, you know, here's your tool set, here's your operating system, here's exactly what you have to use. Because invariably it's not, you know, what I'm really familiar with, and it's actually not what I really like in that. So one of the things that we've sort of looked at in the whole API revolution here at Layer 7 is how can we create tools that developers will naturally use? So in other words, instead of trying to create governance tools and big governance platforms which kind of force developers into a particular model of using things, we sort of asked instead, what do we all use as developers ourselves, and how can we kind of bring those together and leverage them in such a way that it's much more of a natural fit? In other words, you're not telling people you absolutely must use this particular, you know, IDE or anything like that, but instead we're informing people, giving them the tools that they basically need to interface, giving them the tools they need to create relationships and engagement, but at the same time letting them distribute out and make use of the things that they would normally work with. And that's actually what our API portal is about. Really, it's there to create engagement. So if you're an organization that's actually got some kind of developer strategy and actually wants to begin to make APIs available to the outside world, your real challenge isn't necessarily building the APIs as much as creating a community, creating engagement, creating interest around those APIs. Because really, you're only as good as the developer community allows you to be. And so that's a really interesting problem for a lot of enterprises, nonprofit organizations, and even governments, because they really don't know how to do that. It's not something that they've spent a lot of time working on. So really what API Portal is about is giving the tools to that organization so that they can reach out and make it easier for developers to actually start to use APIs. So what I'm showing you right now basically is the API Portal as a developer would see it. So let's say I was just moving along, I'm a developer that has heard about this company, Layer 7, and I've heard they've got some really interesting APIs. They've got some stuff that I think that I could use in my own development. And so this is the first splash page that I'm going to see. And API Portal, of course, is completely skinnable. So what you're seeing right now is the Layer 7 view of it. But of course, it's something that is completely run underneath the hood through a full-featured CMS system. So it can be branded. You can drop in, your own company logos and your own colors and everything like that. So obviously, I work for Layer 7, so I've dropped in a bunch of Layer 7 specific look and feel. But the first thing I'm going to do as a developer, of course, is I want to find out what's there. I want to find out, what the real need is, what kind of documentation I've got, what the APIs are about. I want to dive in fast. Don't give me a lot of friction and problems and signing up or anything like that. Just tell me what's there first of all, because I may lead, based on that there. I'm going to make a snap judgment. So I'll start looking around, and the thing that I got a tip on is that there's a warehouse API that's kind of interesting that Layer 7 actually produces. And so what I'm going to do is open that up, and there's a full description right here in classic pseudo-Latin, of course, of an API that actually gets into a warehouse application. It tells me what inventory is there, what the catalog looks like. Actually even lets me, if I want to actually order things out of the warehouse. So that's interesting because, I'm a developer that works on iPhone apps and Android apps and things like that. And that may be something that I can actually use, to build a kind of a cool new app. So I'll go down and look at it. I'll look at, all the parameters that I need to put in on any particular, get or post or put or delete or what have you. Hey, this one's interesting in that it's both, JSON and XML. It's kind of AC/DC in that respect. So at least I get what I want, which in this case is going to be JSON. And in fact, here's an example of just what comes back. So far, so good. So far, I'm kind of interested and I'm kind of engaged. So I may also look at what resources are available to me, beyond just documentation. So again, I'm going deeper now. There's some code samples, which is even better. In a lot of cases, I may not want to actually go down to the level of having to worry about the nitty-gritty of how I actually write REST calls and things like that. I may just, want to be able to take a simple Objective-C object and actually communicate through that. Abstraction is great. There's an app gallery, which is kind of cool. You can see what other people have done, so that's good for me because I certainly don't want to, just do the same old that everybody else is doing. And then there's something called the API Explorer. And this is going to catch my eye because, of course, this lets me start to experiment, try APIs out. And I'm going to table that for a few minutes because I'm going to wait until I'm actually signed on to show you what that's about. So hold that thought because now I'm really engaged. And the next thing I'm going to do is go over to this forum and start to look. And of course, the forum is one of those tools that I think is the building blocks of the internet these days. Every one of us has, at least one forum that they're addicted to, and probably many. Some of us just troll them, but of course, a lot of the information about, obscure hobbies and that I've learned about, of course, has been on forums and stuff like that. People don't tell me to use a forum. I use forums because I like them and I get a lot of information about them. So this is one of those tools that just naturally fits, okay? It's not something that people are telling me to use. It's still something that I think is useful in engagement. So when I look at these things right here, these sort of first steps that I as a developer see, these first kind of tools, what I'm seeing really is kind of best of breed tools. I'm seeing forums, I'm seeing wikis and blog style stuff. I'm seeing, portals. I'm seeing the tools that I'm used to using already. I'm not seeing big heavyweight governance or anything like that. I'm not, nobody's telling me I have to download something and put it on my my laptop to actually get access. Nobody's forcing me to, fill out lots of paperwork or anything like that to actually get access. In fact, I can just do something as simple as sign up right here, or I can just click in, put the basic information that I need in there to get going. Now, I'm not going to go through that process, of course, because it turns out that I actually have an account on here right now, and I'll sign myself up really I'll sign on really fast here to get into my account. which is really the building block, the place where I go when I want to kind of manage my relationship as a developer with this remote service that Layer 7 is putting on. So the first thing I see, of course, is just the standard dashboard, which gives me some messages from the administrators of the Layer 7 development network. It turns out I don't have any apps yet, so we're going to go through the process of actually building one of those. I've got some messages about the latest API docs. It turns out the one we were looking at earlier was modified, well, I guess about a week and a half ago, 1.5. So, I'm getting updates. I'm getting, information about what's changing there. And there's a bunch of basic services that I maybe wanted to use that I can, kind of see what the status is of, because that of course, is going to be the lifeblood of my application that I build. So let's actually sort of look at what else we can do right here. The next thing to jump down into is the idea of organizations. And here I am right here. I'm the manager of this organization called, AAA Plus Mobile Development and Bail Bonds, okay? So let's say I'm running a small little app development shop, and I've got a couple of people working for me, and we're going to actually try to put something together. We're going to put together a quick little iPhone app, and, it's going to be using these warehouse APIs, and hopefully that's going to make us a little bit of money. So, I'm in here right now, but you know what? I want to start bringing in some of my other contract staff. So, I might go in here and look at my invitations, and I've got an invitation out for, one of the guys, S-Coder. That's Stan Coder right there. And what I'm going to do is invite somebody new. So I might invite James, who maybe works at AAAplusmobile.com. And I'll send him an invitation right here, and that'll fire out. And basically what it'll do is give him the chance to sort of sign up in this, but come into my organization. So in other words, I'm pulling people into my administrative fold. And the reason that's important is because as we begin to build applications, we're actually going to make use of things like shared keys and shared information, because we're all contributing to an app, and that app is actually going to have certain keys for accessing it into those APIs. And all of that really matters because we need to track that kind of stuff. Not only do I, as a developer, have to be able to track where my app is going and how it's being used, but of course, the Layer 7 organization, the one that's actually providing the APIs, needs to be able to track that as well. And the reason they need to track that is they need to be able to start thinking about the whole process of how to manage access and how to begin to manage how often certain apps are allowed to access certain APIs. They need to think about SLAs. They need to sort of identify who their best developer customers are and begin to engage them more and maybe give them better tiers of service simply because they're making them a lot of money. So the whole point of this portal then is really that point of engagement between an organization and the people that are actually using the APIs there. So what we've got now is a couple of developers coming in. So let's go and think about applications then. What we want to do is start to actually add a new application in here. And so what I'm going to do is create what I'm going to call my warehouse iPhone app. And this is the test version that we're going to actually build right here. And what I'm going to do is start to choose different APIs that I want access to. And of course, that can either be approved in some cases by the Layer 7, or it might be something I can get access to right away. So first of all, what I want to do is get access to the warehouse API. So I'm going to get a EULA right here. I'm going to see if that's all okay. Sure, I'm going to accept the terms and conditions for that. And then, you know what, let me go through here. It turns out that there's actually a hosted version of the Twitter API. It's literally a facade on top of Twitter. So calls may go into the Layer 7 development network, but then they get routed out to Twitter. You know what, that may actually be useful in my app because I may want to do things where I can automatically scan in my app for new items that are in the warehouse and, post a message out onto Twitter that, hey, there's something new out there. So I'm going to integrate that in too. So let me accept the terms and conditions there and save that. So what I've done now is I've created this basic warehouse app. And one thing to notice is it's already been provisioned automatically with keys. These are API keys associated with that application. And that key can be shared either across all of the different APIs, but just for that application. Because remember, an application now in the modern world is composed of multiple queries to different APIs. Let's take a look at that. So let me open this up, and and go in and start to manage exactly things like access control associated with that API. I've got both a key, which is basically an identifier not of a human, not of a person, but actually an application itself. And that's going to be actually used to get access to both, the Acme Warehouse API and the Twitter API. I've also got shared secrets and actually hooks into OAuth, all of which is automatically provisioned. I really just have to put in the callback URL, and I can instantly get access to OAuth 1.0a or even OAuth 2. I can also go down and actually look at how I'm provisioning these different APIs in terms of what kind of SLAs are associated with them. Now, right now, I'm automatically getting put into a plan, like an access plan called Sandbox. And Sandbox is just a kick the tires, let's try things out sort of plan. It has limited number of calls that can be made in a day. It has various other, restrictions in terms of total number of calls over the lifetime of that relationship with the API. But I can also actually ask to be put into a different plan. And that may involve something like, let's say, moving into test or production. And a good example might be, I may actually say, you know what, I've been using Twitter for years and that. I've already know exactly what the ramifications of accessing Twitter are. So I'm going to actually ask to go up into the production plan on that. Now, in other cases, what might happen is I may have to actually go through a whole approval process simply because associated with going into a different plan might be cost. Look at a company like Google. You can use the Maps API for free up to a certain number of calls per second or per day. But the minute you begin to exceed that within your app, like let's say you build the next killer iPhone app that's using the Maps API for Google, you're going to be paying. Because Google, of course, will give you the first few for free. But if you're going to drive a tremendous amount of traffic into their API network, you're going to actually get into a profit-sharing situation with them, where you're going to have to, as a developer, pay for access to that. And that's perfectly fine and good, because, there's a free ride up to a point. But eventually, people want to actually make money out of this. And so Layer 7, the company that's actually hosting this warehouse API, may want to start to make money from me. And so I may want to move up into a higher tier of service where I get better service, I get better SLAs, better guarantees and things like that. But of course, I'm willing to pay for that. So that kind of profit sharing between the hoster of an API, the people who are actually building them, and the actual developers of APIs, and managing that relationship is a very important part of that whole kind of new life cycle that's beginning to come out. So right now what I've got then is really the basic beginnings of authorization into APIs. So I mentioned earlier that I may want to start kicking the tires. And remember, let's go back actually now to my resources again and go back to my API Explorer, which gives me the facilities to actually kind of kick the tires a little. And I can go in there and start to actually try some of these APIs out. And in this case, we can try Twitter. We can ask for the Twitter API. We can look for a particular resource here, like let's say the mentions. We want to see, how many times, we've been my company, AAA plus mobile development has actually been mentioned recently. And what I've got is a basic prototype where I can actually go through here and, ask for different formats from Twitter, blah, 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 blah. I can, get a particular count. In other words, everything that has actually been defined within the Twitter API, I've got controls over. I can then go in there and start to tweak authentication. I can say no authentication, HTTP basic, which of course doesn't work anymore on Twitter. They were very, famously turned their back on HTTP. Or I can go into something like OAuth, where I can begin to, put in the keys in that I've been given in my OAuth configuration from Twitter to actually get access to that. So let's not go through all of that right now, because of course it takes a little while. And just let's imagine we're not going to do any authentication in whatsoever. And I can fire off and execute a request, and I instantly get back a response from Twitter, which basically says, not surprisingly, I'm not authorized because I haven't put in any keys or anything like that. But the point is with this thing is it's there to actually make it easier to have to kick the tires, to try things out, to actually experiment a little bit, to sort of crib queries and things like that into a particular API. I can just copy and paste this, and actually literally copy and paste it into a browser or into my app itself, and that's really useful. This doesn't replace rigorous tools for doing regression testing or anything like that. You need those too. But the fact is, what you also need is that middle ground that actually just quickly allows you to try things out. This is sort of the step between doing something really fast, kind of like a crib sheet, you know, and you'd maybe go from this into something like SOAP UI or you know, one of those great applications that's actually really good for building up whole test cases and stress testing and everything like that. So there's a continuum here, and this has a very important you know, role to play in that whole thing. So let's stop and take a breath for a second. Let's think about what we've done. I've come in, I'm an external developer, you know, I've created a virtual application. You know, I can now start to sit down and start coding because I have access to different APIs. I can kick the tires here with my, my Explorer. I've got documentation. I've even got code snippets in that. So I've got pretty much all of the pieces that I need. If I have problems, I can go to the forum. I can begin to ask questions. I can say, hey, you know what, I'm having problems with the warehouse service right now. I can zoom down there and actually, you know, say, look, I tried to do this query, what's going on? And other people in the community can say, I know exactly what your problem is. You know what, we ran into that same one. It's a bit of an idiosyncratic API. You've got to do this escape sequence, you know, change this query and escape it properly, boom, you're good to go. That's the power of real social, you know, social coding in that. Is actually being able to leverage everybody else out there. So we're creating focus. We're creating, you know, a central place where we can all work. And of course, as James mentioned, I'm probably going to, you know, keep all my code in that in GitHub because that's the natural location for all of this. So let's turn the tables a little bit. I'm going to log out right now, and I'm going to log in not as an external developer now, but as an administrator, you know, as part of this development network. And I'm going to show you some interesting things from the other side of the table. So what I'm going to do right now is kind of show the perspective of somebody who works at Layer 7. So a server-side developer, a server-side API developer. And in particular, you know, I'm going to go through and begin to look at the different roles that I can play within, you know, this Layer 7 development group and that. How do they publish APIs? How do they make them available? How do they begin to manage developers coming in and looking at those and that? So the first thing I obviously want to look at is the APIs themselves. And I've got a number of different APIs, and I can, you know, begin to go through and look at each one of them. And in fact, you know, in here, if I, you know, go down my list, I've actually got, you know, let's say my service here, my Andrea API. I can actually edit it and go through. I can do versioning. I can make it private. So I can begin to sort of separate it out from the public APIs and then only assign it to developers who I trust with it. So I'm creating separation there between, you know, maybe internal APIs that are only used by people who I have a very close relationship with, as opposed to the public stuff, which I make available to everybody. I can set different U lists, which of course are really important because that's starting to define my SLAs and my expectations that, you know, of if you're going to use this API, here's what I expect out of you. And I can also begin to assign different plans to it. And of course, I can keep different notes associated with different versions, both public and private, which of course is very, very important. The plans themselves are also important because I can actually go through and begin to play around with different plans and quotas. So here's a good example of what you can start to control through plans. Quotas really are sort of big global things. You know, they have to do with, like, let's say the global number of hits people are allowed to access per month or per day or something like that. And that's global for the entire, you know, API basically. But I can also go in and start to do burst rate limits because I may know that, you know, this particular warehouse API can only really sustain, you know, 10,000 hits per second total, and I never want to exceed that. And I want to start to manage in traffic shape if I get bursts beyond that. I may not want to just, you know, cut it off or drop it, but I may want to, like, delay queries into the next time slot to make sure that I can actually handle that. And trust me, we actually do get people who are hitting, like, insane kinds of rates like that. Remember, you know, James mentioned earlier that Twitter's hitting, what, 18 billion requests a day? I mean, that's extraordinary. But it's not unusual in the modern API economy. Look at all the other, you know, examples that James gave us earlier on. So this is really important because it allows you to start to traffic manage all of that. I can also do things like restrict, you know, time of day and days of week, which is tremendously important for, you know, blackouts for maintenance and things like that. But I can also begin to, you know, bias and prioritize my most important customers. Because, of course, some of those customers are going to be more valuable than others, simply because they're actually starting to pay me. So the other thing that I've got to actually think about are analytics. And both developers want to see how much their applications are accessing particular APIs, but also on the inside, you as an owner of an API, the server-side guys want to be able to manage that. So I may want to zoom in on a particular report API like Andrea service right here, which is one of our test APIs that I happen to know has some data in it. And let's look at what's been going on over the last 7 days there. And what it's going to do is actually query some of the gateways that are actually enforcing access to these APIs. And this is a classic RESTful API. It returns JSON and that. And it's telling me exactly what's going on here. What my throughput looks like in terms of total requests, in terms of successful transactions, but also in terms of errors. And this thing is obviously not in production because it's throwing tons of errors right now. And I've got to get to the bottom of that. That's actually something that's very interesting to me. And I can also go through and begin to zoom in and look at particular time zones where I actually want to really look in a very granular manner to figure out where the issues are. And it's not just about hits a second. I mean, that's sort of a good and important metric, but we also want to look at latency. We also want to be able to manage what our latency looks like. And we're obviously getting a couple of spikes right in here. So we want to get to the bottom of that. What's going on? Why are we suddenly getting a lot of latency there? Is it because our servers are getting swamped? Is it because some of our front-end infrastructure is having problems? Let's get in there and figure out where those issues are, because tuning is going to be incredibly important to us. So basically what I'm going to do is start to wrap this up right here. But what I want to leave you with is this important kind of equation the API portal is about. It is really that piece in the middle that's about engagement. It's really fundamentally about this idea that not only do the builders of the API, the server-side people, have a lot of things to worry about in terms of managing access to their APIs and providing good SLAs, but they've also got the problem of engagement, of being able to reach out and engage and create community around those APIs. And to do that effectively, they need to bring in all of those best-of-breed tools, whether it's forums and wikis and blogs and Git-style revisioning and things like that. All of these tools have to be brought together to actually create kind of this modern development platform. So what API Portal is not about is enforcing stuff that you don't want on there. What it is about is giving you just the tools that you need so you can get the job done and you can get down to coding again, which is really what we're all most interested in. So with that, what I'm going to do is quickly flip back to questions and see what we've got. So I'd like to thank everybody, by the way, for sticking with us. We're coming up real fast onto the top of the hour then, and let's see what kind of questions we've got. Now, Alex, are you there? Have you been collating any questions for us? Okay, I know we've got one right here. Is the deck available for download so I can make some notes? Yes, absolutely. Not only will the deck be available for download on the Layer 7 site, so www.layer7.com, so will this webinar. And actually, you'll be able to replay it and send links to other people. So there should be both SlideShare links and links to YouTube versions of this one as well. And yeah, with that, I think what we're going to do is quickly wrap it up, and I'd like to thank everybody, and most of all, I would really like to thank James for joining me from London. We'll now release him out to the pub, so we can hopefully have a beer at the end of the day. I've still got a full day ahead of me here, but if you have any other questions or anything, by all means, send them in to me at scott@layer7.com, and I'll definitely get back to you. So thanks, everybody. I hope this was useful to you, and hope to see you soon at either another webinar or some conference in the future. Goodbye.